Good afternoon. Welcome to the AJC live subscriber briefing, Plant Vogtle, Dawn of a New Nuclear Era, or costly Gambit. My name is Scott Truby, and I am the editor over the AJC's business, climate, and environment coverage. And thank you all for being here today. And thank you for subscribing to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Your support makes possible everything that we do. In addition to the great journalism we provide you every day, we offer you live events like today's conversation. These bring you inside the newsroom and to meet our reporters and to go deeper into some of our biggest stories and topics. We see these briefings as ways to help us better understand what our readers want to know. Today's briefing will run about 30 minutes. Some of you have already submitted questions, and we will be using some of those questions as part of our discussion today. But we'll also take your questions later in the session. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function on the right sidebar. It's a question mark inside of a circle. You can add your questions, or if you see someone else's questions you like, you can vote to push it up in the queue, so to speak, if you really want to know about that topic. And we'll try to get to them at the end. Joining me today is Drew Can, AJC Climate, Environment, and Utilities reporter. And also joining us is Maris Lutz, a climate and environment freelancer who writes for the AJC in a grant-funded position. Maris writes about the environment and impacts of climate change on people's everyday lives. Plant Vogtle Unit 3 is the first new commercial nuclear reactor to be built from the ground up in the United States and to go into service in 3 decades. Its twin, Unit 4, is expected to become operational in later this year or early next year. Both are billions of dollars over budget and many years behind schedule. Now, before we dive into the conversation, Drew, could you help our readers by setting the scene for with your most recent reporting, what you've done, and including your recent visits there in the past month and before then?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining this and tuning in. So I was most recently down at Plant Vogtle near Augusta at the end of July, and that was when they officially placed Unit 3 into service. But that was more of a visit to be there for what was really a historic moment and to speak to Southern Company executives and some of the Georgia Public Service commissioners that were on hand. The first time I went down there was actually last fall, is when they began loading fuel into Unit 3. That was the first of the 2 new reactors, and I got to see a lot more of the plant that time. They hadn't started splitting atoms inside the reactor, so it was safe to see a bit more of it. So I got to go inside the containment structure, which houses the actual reactor and the spent fuel pool. That's the bright blue pool that you may see on screen or you may have seen before. And then we got to go inside a separate building that they call Turbine Island, and that is what houses these enormous turbines and the blades inside them that spin and power the generators to make electricity. And then, of course, there are the massive cooling towers. That's probably the image that comes to mind for most people when they think of the plant. You can see those for miles away as you approach. But costs and delays aside, if you've never been down there, if you've never seen a nuclear plant, when you see it in person, it is pretty incredible that I think that humans have figured out how to make electricity in this way. It's just a mind-bogglingly huge and complex facility. But yeah, let's dive in and talk about what all of it means for Georgians in the U.S. And, honestly, I think it has global implications for nuclear energy around the world.
Great. Well, hello, and thank you for joining us. As Scott said, my name is Maris, and I cover climate and environment. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We read them all. We tried to, address the main topics and themes here. Vogtle's 2 new nuclear reactors were approved in 2009 with an initial budget of $14 billion. The most recent estimates put that at $35 billion, and that could change. It is also at least 6 years behind schedule. Georgia Power ratepayers have, on average, paid about $1,000 per household to finance the new reactors already. This is according to the Public Service Commission, which regulates Georgia Power. Southern Company, the parent company, is a profitable company that has reported billions in profits over the same period. Readers are asking, why aren't Southern Company shareholders paying for the cost overruns?
Yeah, so I think that is a very good, very valid question, and I think it's one that is going to be argued and litigated extensively in the coming months. Some of the basics. Georgia Power's service territory is established by Georgia law, and it basically gives it monopoly status over a big chunk of the state and roughly currently about 2.7 million customers that are in that. Customers in that territory don't have a choice about who they get their electricity from. And to prevent abuse of that monopoly, the company is regulated by the Georgia Public Service Commission, and they're tasked with balancing customers' needs to have reliable, manageable rates, reliable electricity, and allowing the company to earn a reasonable profit. And they are guaranteed a profit. I think that last part is critical, and really what it all comes down to in a lot of ways. That the company has very wide latitude to ask the commission to allow it to recover costs from customers through rates for all kinds of things, from building gas plants to nuclear plants like Plant Vogtle to installing new transmission lines. And then it's up to the commission's role is to decide what costs are reasonable and whether to allow the company to charge their customers for them.
So Drew, tell me, how did we get here? To the point where we're years behind schedule, billions over budget, but we have actually turned these things on, or the first one on.
Yeah. So like you said, it's taken a lot longer than the company said it would. It's cost a lot more than they said it would. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I've asked Georgia Power about this many times. One of the main points that they make is that the U.S. has not built these nuclear reactors in decades. I mean, these are the first two units built from scratch in the country in more than 30 years. And I do think it's important for people to understand that building nuclear plants is not like building an office building or even a skyscraper. Like every weld has to be perfect. Every bolt has to be tightened to a specified tension. It all has to be required to pass these inspections because of the enormous heat and pressure a lot of it is exposed to when it's operating. Georgia Power also says the nuclear industry, over that time, we hadn't been building reactors, the nuclear industry's kind of know-how and the specialized workforce needed for these projects has atrophied. And, they say they had to work to kind of rebuild that from the ground up, which led to delays and cost overruns. There was also the COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously slowed things down. At its peak, Vogtle was a massive work site. I think there were about 9,000 workers on the site at one point. So as you can imagine, having this deadly virus spreading led to a dip in productivity. But there are a lot of things that I think the company could have done differently that others have put out there. The Public Service Commission staff has talked about this for years. The Department of Energy in some recent reports has got into this. One of the big ones is the project began without a completed design. And I think that led to a cascade of problems that the DOE has detailed: low productivity, poor construction quality, requiring a lot of reworks, workforce attrition. All of those things were problems. They also tried some things with modular construction, so building large components of the reactors and other structures off-site and then shipping them to Vogtle. And I think the idea behind that was they could ship them there and then put them together like some incredibly complex Lego set. That didn't work out, and it led to even more cost overruns and delays. So those are just a little bit of the issues that led to this situation. I think we'll find out a lot more on the specifics and the exact cost and time that resulted from some of these issues in the coming months.
So what do we know about how these new reactors are going to affect prices for Georgia Power ratepayers, and what don't we know yet?
Yeah, so I think the place to start is I think it's important for people to know that ratepayers have already been paying for Vogtle for years. If you look closely at your power bill, you'll probably see a charge on there each month, and it's if you look closely, it's labeled the Nuclear Cost Recovery Tariff. That's been on your bill for years, and I believe that was authorized by the Georgia General Assembly in 2010. It's been on there ever since, and that's to cover the financing cost of the units. The PSC's staff has estimated that by the time Unit 4 is complete, which could be later this year, it could be early next year, the average customer will have paid nearly $1,000 already for Vogtle. The other thing I think is important to note about that is that if all the delays and cost overruns had not occurred, the delays and cost overruns have a lot to do with why people have paid nearly $1,000. The PSC staff has testified that if the project had been completed on time in 2016, 2017, as they initially said it would, people would have paid about half as much at that point. But there are going to be a lot more costs to come. So Unit 3 went into service at the end of July, and because of that, a new rate bump is set to hit customers' bills in the August pay period. If you haven't gotten yours yet, look out for that. It should be roughly between $5 and $6. And then the big pot that will be examined in the coming months is the rest of the cost overruns. So Georgia Power's portion of those is just under $10 billion. And the staff has done some modeling based on a hypothetical situation. The PSC staff has done some modeling based on a hypothetical situation where the company absorbs some of those costs, but is still allowed to recover 7.7 billion of that. And in that scenario, it's likely the average customer will see their bills jump by about $14 in the coming years. So very significant. Georgia Power customers have already faced several rate increases lately on top of that's before Vogtle and on top of Vogtle. The Southern Environmental Law Center has estimated that because of all of this, with Vogtle included, it could push the average customer's bill up by a total of $45 in the next few years. The state already has some of the highest electricity bills in the country, and I think Vogtle is just gonna. I think it's fair to say they're gonna likely climb up the list as a result of Vogtle.
Yeah. So, Drew, how is this all going to be sorted out? I mean, because there is a process to be played out, and I also want to say we will get to the panel questions from the audience a little bit later. But I do want to ask you, how do we sort all this out? How is it going to be sorted out?
Yeah, so you may have seen that last week they may have finished at this point, but Georgia Power began loading fuel into Unit 4, which is the second new reactor at Plant Vogtle near Augusta. They began loading fuel, and that is key for a number of reasons. Not only is it's a key milestone toward completing the unit, but it's significant when it comes to how much ratepayers are going to pay down the line. So now that has happened, Georgia Power can file a request to commence prudency hearings. So that will start a process where the Public Service Commission will hold hearings and review all the outstanding costs for Vogtle and determine which of those were prudent and which of them can be recovered from ratepayers.
Drew, what are the arguments for and against building new nuclear reactors, and who is making those arguments?
So I think the arguments for are that, well, first of all, once the plant is built, the process of building a new power plant requires energy, and currently the amount of steel and concrete that's needed for a project of this scale, that requires a lot of energy, therefore produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, which, if you care about climate change, we want less of those, not more. But once the plant is in service, it's producing electricity, that new electricity comes without any additional greenhouse gas emissions. So that is good. That is a new, clean source, big clean source of electricity for the state of Georgia, enough to power roughly 500,000 homes and businesses. The bad, I think the cost is a big one that people point out. We've talked about how far over budget this is, and then the delays. From a climate change perspective, climate change is an urgent problem. Scientists have been saying for years that we need to draw down emissions rapidly, and that is still not happening. And so, yeah, there's a lot of questions about whether, because of nuclear projects take so long to build and get online, whether it's really a viable solution to cleaning up our power supply.
So, sorry, just a follow up. We had a lot of people asking about solar versus nuclear. How do those work together? Is that a fair comparison? What is the role that nuclear could play in a transition away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, so solar, Georgia is adding a lot of solar, has plans to add a lot more solar in the coming months and years, but comparing it to nuclear is a bit of a apples to oranges comparison. So solar is best way to think about it is an intermittent source of electricity. So it works when the sun is shining. Same with wind, similar not similar technology, but similarly, if the wind is not blowing, you're not producing electricity unless you have a way to store it. Nuclear, coal, and gas are considered "quote unquote" firm power sources, so they can provide power around the clock, and they're a good pair to solar and to deal with some of the intermittence. So you have a reliable source when the sun isn't shining, when the wind isn't blowing. So that's kind of how the two fit together. Now, I think it's worth saying that nuclear is not the only potential solution to fill that need for a big source of firm power supply. The DOE is pumping billions of dollars into a range of technologies. They're looking at long duration energy storage, which is basically these massive batteries that can also be paired with wind or solar to store energy and then dispatch it as electricity when it's needed. I was actually at a plant yesterday up in Alpharetta run by Stryton Energy, where they're developing some of these technologies. And, I think it seems to me that the technology is moving along quickly. There are lots of advances, but I think the cost and the scale needed to get it where it needs to be, where it can provide the amount of electricity that nuclear provides, is a ways off. But, nuclear also has its drawbacks. There's also hydrogen. There's exploration of the potential of carbon capture. None of these are perfect solutions. I think the DOE, what they've told me is that they're exploring all of these possible avenues to draw down emissions.
So Drew, Vogtle, when it was being planned, it was discussed as a possible renaissance for nuclear power generation in the United States. But are there any new reactors of this scale in the pipeline anywhere in the United States right now?
Not of this scale, and there are no signed orders for any new nuclear units after Vogtle once it's complete. There are a few utilities that are interested in doing new nuclear. There are a few other demonstration projects that are in the works as well that have potential to become commercial applications down the line. The most likely candidate, I think, to go down this road, it seems to me, is the Tennessee Valley Authority. I spoke with them for my recent Sunday story, kind of looking at the future of nuclear and what Vogtle means for it. They have identified, a few different sites, but one that they're furthest along with is on the Clinch River near Knoxville, Tennessee. And they're looking at building a small modular reactor there, potentially. That's not on the scale of the Vogtle reactors. Those are about 1,000 megawatt reactors. SMRs, small modular reactors, are smaller than that, anywhere from up to about 300 megawatts. So they don't know exactly what they're going to build, and they haven't decided for sure if they're going to do it, but they are exploring it. And I think if there is a new nuclear plant built in the U.S., and there's a strong likelihood it's built there.
Drew, I think we're going to take some questions from our audience, and anyone who has questions, you are definitely encouraged to drop those into the chat. Many people submitted their questions beforehand, but we really wanted to make sure that we get a mix of, previously submitted questions and current questions. Colin McKinney has asked about the Public Service Commission elections. There's been a lawsuit filed over that. Tell us about where we stand with the elections of the Public Service Commission.
Yeah, so that's, I guess, sort of my purview because it involves the Public Service Commission. The core of that case really has to do with voting rights. But I think essentially we're just waiting on a ruling in that case from the court. I do not know what the status of that is. I don't think anyone knows. I think most people expected that we would know something by now. But it's a big question mark. There were supposed to be 2 Public Service Commission seats up for election last November. That still has not happened. It's unclear when it will. But myself and my colleagues will be all over that and let you know as soon as there's something to know about it.
Drew, so DB asks, what will happen with radioactive waste from Plant Vogtle?
Yeah, so this is pretty interesting. So the U.S. has explored long-term storage solutions for its nuclear waste, but those the main site is I believe it's Mount Yucca in Nevada was the site that was identified to store that. It has not ever been completed, and no nuclear waste has been stored there yet. So in the meantime, nuclear facilities in the U.S., Vogtle included, initially they store their spent fuel in these pools to let the material decay, let the radiation go to a safe level, temperatures go down, and then over time, when they run out of space in those pools, they actually transfer them to these huge concrete casks. And to my knowledge, every bit of fuel that Plant Vogtle has ever used to generate electricity is still stored on the site in these casks, and it's still TBD what is going to happen to those ultimately. I mean, I think the the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that regulates the nuclear industry, says that generally speaking, this is a okay way to do this, but I don't think it's I think it's fair to say it's not a perfect long-term solution to storing these things, and we'll see if the government, if the political will exists to find a perfect permanent storage place.
We have another reader question. Bob James asks, how do we get Georgia utilities to plan to meet net zero emission goals getting off of natural gas?
Another good question. So last year, so every 3 years, Georgia Power goes through what's called an integrated resource planning docket, and that's where they basically chart what their energy future is going to look like for the next 10, 20 years. And they went through one of those processes last year, and they are adding a good chunk of solar in the coming years. They're also adding a lot of natural gas capacity. For climate change, if you care about climate change, natural gas is a cleaner source than coal. They're also shuttering a lot of coal plants. Natural gas is a cleaner source than coal in terms of the amount of carbon burning natural gas emits compared to coal, but the extraction of natural gas also releases lots of methane, which can also trap lots of heat, very bad for the climate. I think ultimately it comes down to what the company proposes in its next planned IRP, which I believe is set for 2025, and what the Georgia Public Service Commission approves for them. I expect there will be a lot more solar added at that point. We'll see if gas is part of it. Perhaps more battery storage will be in this next round. But yeah, it's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
Drew, Chris, and hopefully I'm pronouncing this last name correctly, Dydra asks, what can be learned from the construction of this plant to facilitate the building of more plants to mitigate climate change?
So I think the federal government is hoping that a lot is learned from this plant, although it remains to be seen whether that will happen. I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's very unlikely that another plant exactly like Vogtle is built, another unit like the two that are being built at Plant Vogtle is built. Like I said, it's possible that smaller reactors are built. And I think what they're hoping is that some of the mistakes that led to the delays and cost overruns at Vogtle, the use of an incomplete design, a lot of the rework, a lot of the productivity issues that we've already chronicled, that they can learn from that, and it will be a smoother process next time it happens. I think they're also trying to preserve the workforce that was stood up to build Vogtle, and not let it atrophy, I guess, as it had over the decades, which I think is part of the problem and the reason why Vogtle took so long and cost so much. The DOE is really hoping all those things happen, but like I said, there are no signed orders for new commercial nuclear units right now in the U.S.
We have a question which from Robert Searfoss, which seems it's as much a comment as it is a question, but I want to ask, he's asking who should pay for the buildings and construction screw ups and mistakes. But for people, customers or those who made the mistakes, For people who are upset about this process or want to weigh in, what are their options? Because you did say that there are hearings coming up at the Public Service Commission, which ultimately has say over what costs get passed on to ratepayers. So for people who want to have an influence to understand this process, how can they get involved?
Yeah, so there are a couple ways. I mean, the simplest way, if you want to keep track of it, you can continue subscribing to the AJC. I'll be covering all of it. But if you want to watch the hearings yourself, you can do so. The Georgia Public Service Commission has a YouTube channel. They stream all of their hearings. I assume these will be streamed as well, so you can watch those. You can also, if you want to address the Georgia Public Service Commission directly, you can come to a hearing in person. They're in downtown Atlanta. The commission typically allows, I think, for about an hour of public comments before certain hearings. So, and they give people, I think, about 3 minutes each to speak. So that's another way that people could potentially weigh in and get involved.
Got another other audience questions coming in, and this one's from Roger Mann. Are we going to see cost savings on our bills going forward after the cost overruns at Vogtle are paid for?
It's a good question. I don't think we know for sure. I think it's unlikely. I mean, I think Georgians are likely to be paying for Vogtle for many, many years. It's a bit hard to say what the energy landscape will look at the point when we have covered all the cost overruns. So I don't think we know. I would say I don't think it's likely that people are going to be seeing their bills go down anytime soon.
Looks like we've got another question coming in from Mary, who asks, am I the only listener who remembers 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, and others? These are relevant memories that explain why no other nuclear plants are underway in the U.S. Why is our state so open to jeopardizing the health and safety of our residents? This is Mary's question. Can you talk a little bit about both those incidents, but also the safety track record of nuclear?
Yeah, I mean, those were very significant incidents. I mean, Chernobyl, the most serious probably of the bunch. Fukushima also, 3 Mile Island also, a scary situation. Thankfully, I don't believe any deaths were directly connected to that, but still a serious situation. It's definitely a concern with nuclear. I will say that one of the big, I guess, benefits of the new Vogtle plants, they do have significant added passive safety features to shut down, if anything goes wrong, as well as, very experienced operators obviously running the plants. Another thing I think is worth bringing up is that the cost overruns and delays that Vogtle experienced is not unique for nuclear power projects. So the first 2 Vogtle units 1 and 2 that are still on the site were finished in the late 80s, also ran into huge cost overruns and delays. I think they were supposed to cost like just under $2 billion and ended up costing about $9 billion. So, this is not the first time a project like this has run into issues.
Well, I think that we have come to just about the end of our time for this event. First off, I wanted to thank my fellow panelists and thank you to our subscribers who have joined us today. And please keep the conversation going. I mean, you can email us. Our email addresses are on the AJC website. If you have questions or other things that you want us to pursue, we would like to know about it. And again, you as our subscribers help make things like this and our work possible. So again, wanted to thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.